In this section, we'll look at Eisenhower's foreign policy in his second term, from 1957 until 1960. Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles strongly favored the Western European countries strengthening the economic bonds between them. In this way, it'd be more difficult for the communists to turn any one country against the other. Unity would lift prosperity for all, which would diminish the chance of revolution in any one country. Accordingly, in March 1957, France, West Germany, Italy, Holland, Luxembourg, and Belgium signed a treaty in Rome creating the European Economic Community. It called for free movement of labor and capital between the nations and the gradual abolition of all tariffs and trade barriers between them. In 1960, Britain, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, Austria, and Portugal formed the European Free Trade Association, another economic unity that would be a rival to the European Economic Community for a number of years. Eventually, however, Britain joined the European Economic Community and left the European Free Trade Association, and what we now become known as the European Common Market was beginning to take shape. Many people assumed the European Common Market would inevitably lead to some kind of political union, and indeed, in the 1990s, the European Union was formed with the euro as its currency. Late in the 1950s, Eisenhower's many Latin American problems sort of came to a head in Cuba. At the time, Cuba was ruled by the dictator Fulgencio Batista. Batista was corrupt and absolutely brutal to his political opposition, but he remained pro-Western and anti-communist. He protected America's dominance in Cuba, so Americans supported him. Not surprisingly, a nationalist revolution emerged, led by Fidel Castro. In late 1958, Castro overthrew Batista, who fled the country. A minority of Cubans who had lived well under the Batista regime fled as well to Miami, where they remained staunchly anti-Castro, and remain today. Castro, meanwhile, began a sort of a social revolution, breaking up large cattle ranches and sugar plantations and giving land to the peasants. Many people in the United States noted the unfairness of Batista's regime and cautioned patience, hoping that Castro was just a nationalist reformer and not a committed communist. Indeed, in April 1959, Castro even came to the United States and spoke well of future American-Cuban relations. He promised that he would not expropriate any future private property unless there was compensation. After returning to Cuba, however, he appeared to renege on his promises. He tried to borrow money from U.S. banks, but rejected their terms because he said they conflicted with his plans for economic development. As he began nationalizing more and more foreign and U.S. property, he was increasingly brutal to his opposition, and Americans were growing increasingly wary. After Eisenhower met Khrushchev for the first time in Geneva, part of the ongoing Geneva talks, Khrushchev began pushing for an additional détente. The two countries agreed to a number of exchanges, including an exhibition on American life in Moscow. And in the summer of 1959, Vice President Richard Nixon was on hand to open this exhibit, and while standing in front of a display of an American kitchen, and of course with the cameras rolling, Khrushchev and Nixon sort of engaged in a spontaneous debate on the merits of communism and capitalism. Nixon was able to point to the modern time-saving devices the Americans enjoyed and arguably gained the upper hand. This became known as the kitchen debate. As the two sides considered the possibility of yet another summit in Geneva, Khrushchev agreed to come to the United States and Eisenhower agreed to go to the Soviet Union. In September 1959, Khrushchev and his family arrived in Washington. Over the next several days, he visited Eisenhower at the presidential retreat at Camp David in the Maryland mountains, toured New York City, and visited Los Angeles. He was scheduled to visit Disneyland, but the police chief canceled the visit, saying he couldn't keep Khrushchev safe and secure. Khrushchev said he was disappointed and joked that he wondered if the Americans were hiding missiles there. Khrushchev ended his tour by visiting San Francisco and even then going to Iowa. Everyone agreed the visit was a tremendous success in improving relations, even if nothing substantive was accomplished. A month after Khrushchev departed, the two countries announced that there would be a summit in Paris in May 1960, and that Eisenhower would visit the Soviet Union in June 1960. 2 weeks before the Paris summit was set to begin, a high-altitude American U-2 reconnaissance plane, spy plane, was shot down over the Soviet Union. The U.S. at first claimed that it was a routine weather flight from an overseas base near the Soviet Union that had mistakenly gone astray. Khrushchev waited until the Americans had stated publicly their cover story before revealing evidence that the plane was, in fact, a spy plane, and that its pilot, Gary Francis Powers, had been captured alive. The Americans had flown several previous spy missions over the Soviet Union, and it appeared to the Americans that Soviet fighters couldn't fly that high, and the Soviet missiles couldn't hit the U-2 at that altitude. Of course, they were wrong. The Americans, therefore, were caught in a public lie. The pilot, Powers, had poison at stake to enable the U.S. to keep up plausible deniability, but Powers didn't take it. The Soviets put Powers in a public trial for the world's media and made the most of their political advantage. Eisenhower accepted the responsibility and even acknowledged that spy missions had been taking place since 1956. He would not, however, apologize as Khrushchev demanded. Khrushchev canceled Eisenhower's scheduled visit to Moscow, and the planned summit in Paris, of course, fell through. The Soviet people, he claimed, were too upset by the whole episode to greet an American president with proper cordiality. With his propaganda coup, the Soviets sentenced Powers to 10 years, including 7 at hard labor. In 1962, Powers was released in a swap of captured spies, an episode recently dramatized in a 2015 Tom Hanks movie. If Eisenhower didn't have enough problems, there was growing anti-Americanism in Japan by 1960. In 1951, the U.S. and Japan had signed a post-war treaty that allowed the United States the right to maintain military bases in Japan, as well as to call on Japan for help in a war. In the late 1950s, a new prime minister came into power without official elections and promised to expand close military cooperation with the U.S. Very quickly, a strong opposition grew in Japan, fearful of being dragged into a nuclear war and already resentful of the foreign presence on their soil. So by 1960, you begin to see organized protests, which had frequently devolved into physical violence, aimed at the U.S. as much as at the prime minister. In the end, the prime minister resigned, but the bases remained. As Eisenhower's presidency wound down in 1960, Eisenhower was becoming increasingly fed up with Castro. He was, it appeared, more of a communist than a nationalist as he continued to nationalize private property and crack down on his political opposition. Eisenhower could have no more of it. In October 1960, helped pass a trade embargo on Cuba, stopping all trade with the exception of medical items and food. Of course, this in time drove Cuba more into the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, as thousands of Cuban exiles from Cuba flooded into Miami, the CIA had a plan to arm them, train them, and send them back into Cuba to topple Castro. And as Eisenhower left office, the CIA was training these Cuban exiles in the mountains of Guatemala at a secret base. This concludes the section on Eisenhower's foreign policy in his second term from 1957 to 1960.